On today's Gangster Profile, how the Italian Mafia took over Irish Boston. Welcome back, guys. First off, let me take a moment to thank everyone for the tremendous response to my last video. I hadn't had a video break 10,000 views, period, and that video got over 14,000 views in its first 24 hours. I also gained over 200 new subscribers, putting me over 1,000 total. Welcome to our new friends. My whole goal starting this was to try to get to 1,000 subscribers. I honestly didn't think it was going to be possible, let alone to do it in less than 3 months. I'm blown away. Thank you guys for your support and all the kind words in the comments as well. I will continue to try to put out quality product and keep you guys happy. I'd like to also take a quick moment to send my warmest wishes to the Romano family and again thank Michael Romano Sr. for taking the time to speak to me. He's an incredible man and hopefully I can work in some sort of capacity with him in the future. Also, through a third party, I've been in contact with Gigi Portala, who expressed interest in maybe an interview or a video that includes audio of him explaining his side of events. We'll see. I'm currently trying to get in direct contact with him through this third party. This has been a surreal experience to say the least. Like, wow. This video I'm about to do is a request. I try to have a very interactive experience with my subscribers and viewers. A lot of my videos stem from requests that viewers make. This video came about from two OG Gangster Profile viewers, subs and supporters, Mike Gill and Chris Danju. Mike wanted a video about Gaspari Messina, and Danju wanted a video about the South Boston Gustin gang. Both of the subjects are in this video. Big shout out to these two guys. They are two of my biggest supporters. Make sure you leave a comment and a request. I check them all. So let's get it on. Everyone knows that Boston is an Irish city. Boston historically is about green a city as it gets in the United States. All the way up until the turn of the last millennium, Boston and Irish were synonymous. In the last decade or so, it's more like overpriced housing and yuppies are synonymous with the city. But that, not on this channel, goddammit. On this channel we celebrate dirty old Boston of my grandparents, parents, and my childhood. Damn progression and gentrification, and the unbridled greed that is making it impossible for normal people to afford living in this region. God damn it! Anyhow, back to my point of Boston always being a historically Irish city. Then how is it that the minority group of Italians have dominated the underworld for the majority of the 20th century? Well, there's actually a multitude of reasons for this. One of the simplest reasons being the organization of the Italian gangs compared to the disorganization of the Irish gangs. But specifically in the city of Boston, one day's events shifted the power balance in the underworld in the Italian Mafia's favor, and from that day forward, they never looked back. The Irish were the first immigrant group to move into Boston en masse. After the Great Potato Famine in the 1860s, the first waves of Irish immigrants washed up onto Boston's shores. They were not met with kindness by the ruling Brahmin class of Boston. The waspy Protestant Brahmins looked down at the Catholic Irish with old world disdain. The Irish first settled in the North End, which was not a desirable place to say the least. There was a bustling, dirty waterfront where the immigrants first arrived. Beyond that were dirty tenements with cold water and no electricity. Besides the waterfront and the tenements, there was also industrial blight and factories. The Irish within the first generation moved into different areas of the city and planted their flag. South Boston and Charlestown were thoroughly Irish the entire 20th century, just up until the last 2 decades. Also Dorchester to a certain degree as well. The next group to enter Boston were Eastern European Jews who immigrated to America in the 1880s, fleeing anti-Semitism in Ukraine and Russia, for example. They replaced the Irish in the North End ghetto, but like the Irish, they quickly moved into different neighborhoods. The Old West End, whose tenements were torn down during urban renewal in the 1960s, was the heart of old Jewish Boston. By the 1930s, a lot of Jewish Bostonians lived in Roxbury and Mattapan before being replaced by black Bostonians in the late 1950s. The last major European ethnic group to enter Boston was the Italians and Sicilians. Like all new groups to the city, they settled first in the North End ghetto as well. From the 1890s through the 1910s, thousands of Italians and Sicilians poured into the city. Unlike their predecessors, the Italians embraced their North End neighborhood and made it their own. The Italians did eventually move into the neighborhoods of East Boston and the neighboring city of Revere, which also became Italian strongholds in the Boston area. I feel like a lot of the original Italians that came to Boston, especially the criminals, liked the North End. Through its cramped, narrow streets, winding alleys, and cramped brick tenements, it was almost like a neighborhood fortress. If you were not from the North End, you stuck right out. This was the same right up until the turn of the millennium. So naturally, criminals saw the advantage to this. Also, I believe the Italian community as a whole liked to being insular from the rest of the city. The Irish, who were the first immigrant group, had obtained many of the city's municipal jobs: policemen, firemen, clerks, trolley operators, etc. The Italians had a bit of a mistrust for the system in Boston that was stacked against them. This was common in a lot of the big cities in America at this time period, such as New York and Chicago. The Italian gangsters certainly tried to avoid the mostly Irish police at all costs. And if the ruling Brahmins looked down on the Irish, they thought the Italians to be even more inferior. So the Italians were content to stay in their protected areas and build up their power base and strength until their time came. In 1915, a Sicilian man, along with his wife and 2 children, moved to Boston on North Street near the North End wharfs and opened a bakery across the street from his house. This man's name was Gaspare Messina, and he is the first recognized boss of the Italian Mafia in Boston. His title officially was Rappresentante. It is believed he was a representative of the New York boss at the time, Salvatore d'Aquila. It is believed that before Luciano's commission in the National Syndicate, the Old World Mafia leaders sent out representatives to U.S. cities to handle local disputes and communicate back to their boss. Gaspare and his wife Frances Reggio, after being married, sailed from Palermo to New York City on November 10, 1905 on the SS Città di Napoli on an extended honeymoon. After staying with Messina's cousin Francisco Accardi in Brooklyn for a time, they liked it so much that they decided to get their own place and stay permanently. The couple's first 2 children were born in Brooklyn, Salvatore and Luciano. Gaspare ran a bakery on the surface, but under the surface he was working with the mafia boss Salvatore d'Aquila. This was the period of the Mustache Pete's, or the Old World Mafia leaders, such groups as the Black Hand and the like. They ruled with old world politics in an ancient style. They mostly extorted their own countrymen with threats of violence. They were involved in loan sharking, and before they took their anti-drug stance in the 1950s, the early mafia was heavily involved in early American narcotics trafficking. When Messina and his family moved to Boston, it's believed to be part of this early Italian crime network. Boston authorities noticed right from the moment Messina stepped foot in Boston, he was recognized as an underworld authority in his new city. This would prove he had the backing of important people. Besides the bakery across from his house on North Street, Messina opened a wholesale grocery store at 28.5 Prince Street with other known underworld associates Paolo Pagnotta and Frank Cucchiara. On the surface, Messina seemed to be a successful businessman, but to those in the know, he was the first godfather of Boston. After a highly publicized arrest and being all over the papers for having his car shot up, Paolo Pagnotta was dropped as a partner. Messina didn't want the heat attached to his legitimate business. Cucchiara, who was from Salemi, the same Sicilian village that a lot of these mafiosi were from, would eventually start his own cheese business in the North End, most likely as another partial front. Messina traveled back to Sicily in August 1924 to show off how well he was doing in his new country, apparently arriving in Sicily with a large amount of American currency. The following year, he and his growing family of 4 children moved to the neighboring city of Somerville. Messina also had an address that he kept in New York that he used for his immigration papers. He also kept close to the New York Mafia. Messina had gained a level of independence by moving to Boston, and by the 1920s his old boss Salvatore d'Aquila was embroiled in a war with another Mustache Pete over control of New York called Joe the Boss Masseria. Joe the Boss was the boss of a young Charles Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese. Aquila was losing the war and retreated from Brooklyn to the Bronx. Messina, seeing the writing on the wall, started making inroads with Joe the Boss's crew. Shortly after this, d'Aquila was shot to death on October 10, 1928, a half mile from Messina's Manhattan address. Not really sure if Messina set him up, but it looks a little suspicious. D'Aquila's death did little to stop the fighting. War erupted after his death, with many Sicilian Castellammarese mafioso joining d'Aquila's supporters. Many of these Sicilians opposed Joe the Boss Masseria as the boss of bosses. They thought he was a greedy glutton whose appetites could not be satisfied. The brutal conflict would be dubbed the Castellammarese War, and it would shape the Italian Mafia throughout the 20th century. Trying to find a diplomatic solution to stop the killings, Joe the Boss agreed to step down and Gaspare Messina was selected as the temporary boss of bosses. He was well respected by all mafioso, and he was even-tempered. It was a solid choice. Messina organized a large meeting with all the mafia leaders in the U.S. in Boston in December 1930. The convention was in order to try to sustain peace within the Italian Mafia so they could make more money and become stronger. The meeting did not have the desired effect. Joe the Boss would not stop grabbing with both hands, so he was eventually set up by underling Lucky Luciano. During their meal, Luciano went to the bathroom. While he was taking a piss, a hit squad including Bugsy Siegel and Vito Genovese killed Masseria, ending the Castellammarese War on April 15, 1931. That is until Salvatore Morenzano named himself Capo de Tutti Capi, sparking off another round of killings, but that's another story. While all this was transpiring, back in Boston, Prohibition was in full swing, as was illegal bootlegging and rum running. I did a video a little while back about Prohibition-era Boston where I discussed how families like the Kennedys acquired their family fortunes during Prohibition. Joseph P. Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy family and JFK's father, was one of the most successful rum runners/bootleggers in the whole country, let alone Boston. He was connected to the bootlegger king Big Bill Dwyer and Irish gangster Oni the Killer Madden, both from New York City's West Side Hell's Kitchen neighborhood. These guys controlled a large portion of the higher quality whiskey and other liquors entering the U.S. illegally during Prohibition. Joseph Kennedy would use his underworld contacts later in the 1960s election to get his son JFK elected during the incredibly close election with Richard Nixon. After appointing his brother Robert Bobby Kennedy as Attorney General, Bobby went right after the Mafia, who allegedly just helped his brother get elected president. The Mafia did not react well to this, and this remains the strongest explanation for the assassination of JFK and then his brother Robert. Joseph P. Kennedy used the wealth that he gained from bootlegging to further him and his family. He didn't want to be seen as a criminal or a gangster, but as a legitimate businessman. He always had much higher aspirations for himself and his family. Kennedy wasn't the only big-name Irish bootlegger in Boston during Prohibition, though. The wild and well-connected Gustin gang of South Boston were probably the toughest, most feared gang in Prohibition-era Boston. Frankie Wallace and his brother Stephen James originated from the Irish enclave of South Boston. They first came onto the police radar around the year 1910 when they became suspects in a rash of truck hijackings and armed robberies. They referred to themselves as the Tailboard Thieves. Frank Wallace was tough, ballsy, and wild. He was the archetyped Irish Prohibition gangster. You know, the Tommy gun-toting James Cagney type. Along with his brother Steve, who was a former Olympian boxer, and other Irish South Boston hoodlums, they created the Gustin Gang. To add on to their already established armed robbery and truck hijacking resume, they started bootlegging as soon as Prohibition began. The Gustin Gang derived its name from a street off Old Colony Avenue where a lot of these gang members were from. There were a lot of thirsty and angry Irish Bostonians when the Volstead Act was passed down, and the Gustin Gang were here to service their needs. The Gustin Gang became one of the preeminent bootleggers in the city of Boston, along with Kennedy and the Jewish King Charles Solomon, who I covered extensively in my video about Prohibition-era Boston. One of the top speakeasies in the city was on Old Colony Ave, known as the Sportlight, and the Gustin Gang provided them with all their illegal alcohol. That location would go on to become the infamous Cork and Bull Tavern, where Billy O took his last drink before being killed by the Mullins Gang. Frank Wallace had connections with other Irish gangsters throughout the country and would use his contacts for alcohol supplies. Eventually, the Gustins would get big enough where they would own a few of their own rum-running boats. That way they could cut out the middleman and maximize their bootlegging profits. Wallace apparently had been involved in a botched armed robbery in Detroit with other Irish gangsters where a man was killed. Using his connections that he had with Irish politicians back at home, Wallace was able to get out of any prison time associated with this crime. It's alleged that Wallace had deep political connections back in Boston, with his lawyer being State Senator John W. McCormick. Frank Wallace, who had been arrested 25 times, had only been sentenced to jail twice. Boston was a notoriously corrupt city, and the amount of money made from illegal bootlegging was staggering. A lot of this money went into the hands of law enforcement officials and politicians. Everything was going smooth for the Gustins. That's until they started hijacking other gangsters' liquor shipments. They apparently weren't satisfied with the money they were making off their own bootlegged alcohol, so they started stealing other gangs' booze and selling it. When they hijacked a couple trucks that belonged to the North End Italian Mafia, they didn't realize it at the time, but it spelt big trouble for Frankie Wallace and the Gustin gang. While Gaspare Messina was tasked with trying to delegate peace in the Castel Morizzi War, a couple of young men were looking after his interests in Boston. Filippo Phil Buccola and Joe Lombardo were rising stars in the Boston Mafia. The Italian Mafia also profited greatly from Prohibition and the illegal sale of alcohol. That's where the New York Mafia got the capital that helped them infiltrate legitimate businesses and unions in the 20th century. The Mafia in Boston was no different. Gaspare Messina's wholesale grocery store in the North End was largely a front for bootlegged alcohol. After trying to sow peace to the warring mafioso in New York, Gaspare Messina in the late 30s retired, leaving Phil Buccola in charge. Buccola, who immigrated to the United States from Palermo, Sicily at the ripe age of 32, was already a well-established mobster before he even came to America. Palermo is the main city on the island of Sicily, and its mafia roots are ancient. Buccola came to America in 1920 at the onset of Prohibition. This was common for Sicilian and Southern Italian mafioso who were already established in their homeland. They came to America when they saw the huge financial opportunity that Prohibition offered. Upon arriving to Boston, Buccola settled in the Italian enclave of East Boston, where he worked on paper at least as a fight promoter, but really most of his income was derived from bootlegging and other illegal enterprises. Buccola, by the end of the 1920s, was at the head of a gang of Sicilians in East Boston and kept close ties with his contacts back in Palermo. With his even-tempered manner and old-world style, Buccola was a natural choice for Messina upon his retirement. The other man that rose to the top of the newly forming Boston Mafia was named Joseph Lombardo. Lombardo, who also immigrated to Boston from Sicily, settled in the North End and set up his operations there. Joseph Lombardo was from a village named Salemi, Sicily, which is the same village that Gaspare Messina and Frank Cucciaro were from. It was very common for people from the same villages to settle in the same neighborhood upon immigrating to the United States. It's very watered down now, but almost all the Sicilians in Gloucester, my home city, are from the same village of Terracini in Sicily. They all settled in the Fort and West End neighborhoods of Gloucester, and that's where the greasy pole competition and the St. Peter's Fiesta comes from. It was started in Terracini, Sicily. Joseph Lombardo is a very mysterious man. There's not a lot written about him on the internet. I think in the future I'll try to do a deep dive and see if I can find any more information on the man. Lombardo, who while in Brooklyn was a contemporary of Lucky Luciano and Al Capone, came to the North End of Boston around 1925. Whether he came to Boston at the urging of other mafioso like Luciano to further bootlegging operations or not, within a few years of being in Boston, Lombardo had established himself as a power in Boston. He already had a contact when he came to the city. Frank Chichi Cucciaro had already established himself in Boston and set Lombardo up upon arrival. After becoming friends in Brooklyn, Cucciaro moved to Boston and paved the way for the likes of Lombardo. Lombardo and Cucciaro were arrested and involved in a conspiracy involving morphine and explosives. Chichi was the only representative from the Patriarcha family to be present at the infamous Appalachia Conference. Lombardo, who was quiet and reserved, was feared and respected as well, and quickly rose to the ranks of the Boston Mafia. He had a very regal old-world style about him, and it was said that he could squash any beef between underlings simply by showing up and speaking some sense to them. Officially, it's written that Buccola became boss after Messina retired and Lombardo was his underboss, but it's also been theorized that Lombardo was actually the boss and called the shots, and Buccola was simply a figurehead. Either way, these two men ruled over the Boston Mafia from the end of Prohibition into the early 1950s. They quietly built up their power base, became stronger and richer. Under their rule, they would expand the territory to encompass all of New England and laid out the groundwork for what today is considered the New England Patriarcha crime family. But during Prohibition, this was not the case. The Italian Mafia had their piece of Boston, but that was it. They were almost considered small time compared to kingpins like Charles King Solomon and Irish gangsters, but that would all change one day in 1931. On December 22, 1931, the power balance in Boston's underworld would be forever shifted in the Italian Mafia's favor. At this point, the Gustins had no fear of any other gangsters in Boston, and their actions were now borderline reckless. They were hijacking other bootleggers' liquor shipments and reselling them. In some instances, they would hold the stolen shipment as ransom and sell it back to the same gangsters they stole it from. Pretty brazen behavior. Well, one of these fellow bootleggers that Frank Wallace and the Gustins were hijacking was none other than North End mafioso Joe Lombardo. After hijacking several of Lombardo's beer trucks, the Gustin gang started getting a little too ballsy. Wallace sensed that Lombardo's lack of action stemmed from weakness, so he started targeting Lombardo's trucks, thinking there would be no retribution. This was a grave miscalculation by Frankie Wallace, for Lombardo and the Italian/Sicilian Mafia were not the kind of men to cross. Lombardo sent an official message to Wallace to knock it off and stay away from his liquor shipments. Wallace scoffed at Lombardo, probably thinking, who does the Sicilian nobody think he is? So instead of walking away, Wallace raised the stakes and commandeered one of Lombardo's liquor-making stills and held it for a $500 ransom. Lombardo was done playing these games, and he put out an official ticket, or like the Mexican Mafia calls it, a green light, basically saying Frankie Wallace or Gustin gang members should be killed on sight. Apparently Frankie Wallace thought this was a joke and put no concern into the threat. Then on one fateful day on December 22, 1931, Frankie Wallace and members of the South Boston Irish Gustin gang were summoned to the Joe Lombardo's office at 317 Hanover Street in the North End. Definitely not Gustin turf. They were summoned to Lombardo's office at the Testa building, which held various offices. On the third floor was Lombardo's office, C&F Importing. Stevie Wallace, Frankie's brother and Gustin enforcer, urged Frankie not to go to the North End. He said it was much too dangerous. Frankie shrugged his brother off. He planned on showing up in force. He thought he would easily intimidate Lombardo and the Italians. Moments before the Gustin gang showed up, Boston police officer Patrick McCool entered the C&F Importing office to ask Lombardo if he wanted to buy tickets to the police Christmas ball. He was going door to door selling tickets. Lombardo, who the officer regarded as a gentleman, said he had already purchased some. After leaving the office, moments later in the late morning, Frankie Wallace showed up in a two-car procession with top enforcer Barney Dodo Walsh, Timothy Coffey, and a few other men. Wallace was under the assumption that he was going to stroll into C&F Imports with a crew and maybe slap Lombardo around and assert his dominance. They certainly weren't there peacefully. They were all armed. Anyhow, they walked into a much different situation than Frankie Wallace had imagined. He should have heeded his brother's warning. The men walked up 3 flights of stairs, and while Frankie and Dodo Walsh entered the C&F office, a secretary across the hall in a law office recalls what happens next. Within seconds, there was a loud crash like chairs and desks being overturned, then a single gunshot followed by a barrage of shots, shouts, screams, and curses. Throughout the building, people on all floors stood still as the chaos ensued with gunshots flying and things crashing everywhere. A woman named Miss Franklin on the first floor said it sounded as if the whole building was going to come down. Frankie Wallace burst into a law office across the hall holding a smoking gun he had just emptied. He was bleeding heavily from his armpit. A bullet had entered his armpit and gone directly into his heart. He dropped the gun and collapsed in a grotesque fashion with his head between his legs, dying like that within moments. Another Gustin member ran to the room, picked up Frankie's gun and threw it through the window, smashing it in the process. He then, while holding a revolver in one hand, picked up the phone and called the police to report the crime before fleeing downstairs to the first floor, where the men straightened out their clothes before walking out into the North End and disappearing. When the police arrived, they found Timothy Coffey hiding in one of the offices, cowering behind a desk petrified. Frank Wallace wasn't the only Gustin member casualty. His enforcer, Dodo Walsh, was shot in the chest and killed as well. The office was trashed. All the furniture was broken and turned over. It was a real melee. Nobody ever reported what happened for certain in that room, but it certainly had all the makings of a well-executed ambush. This was an absolute spectacle in the North End. Over 2,000 people showed up in front of the Testa building on Hanover Street to watch the police bring out the bodies. Apparently Stevie Wallace had a hard time identifying his brother because he was so distorted upon his death. After going on the lam for several weeks after the killings, Lombardo was picked up for the murders, but because of a lack of evidence, he and the other 7 suspects were not convicted and let go. This really led to the myth of Joseph Lombardo. Up until this point, Frankie Wallace, who besides King Solomon was the top gangster in Boston during Prohibition, but he crossed Lombardo and now he was dead. Lombardo was certainly a man to be feared, and so was the Boston Mafia. On this day in 1931, the Boston Mafia showed their teeth. They were dangerous and deadly, and it was unwise to cross them. From this day forward, the power balance shifted and it would stay this way for almost 100 years. Steve Wallace tried to take revenge against the Mafia for his brother's death, but was never able to get at them. The Gustins were severely handicapped after this, and even though a member named Spike took over leadership role, they would never be the same and quickly lost power. In the 1930s, most of the members were falling into alcoholism. For his role in the day's events, Gustin member Timothy Coffey was viewed as a coward and a traitor. He was severely beaten several times by Gustin members before going into hiding. Frankie's brother, the Olympian boxer Stevie Wallace, especially seethed in contempt over Coffey's cowardice during the ambush. Over the next few years, the Italian Mafia consolidated their power base. 2 years after Frankie Wallace's murder, Jewish kingpin Charles King Solomon was killed in a nightclub bathroom. Although the crime was committed by Irish and Greek hoods, it's widely thought that Bucala was the man who orchestrated the hit. He wanted to wipe out Solomon, who was the main competition to Mafia dominance in Boston. Then finally to consolidate their power base in the whole New England region and not just Boston. In 1932, he had Frank Bootsy Morello killed. Morelli was a Providence, Rhode Island mobster who, along with his gang, controlled bootlegging and illegal gambling enterprises from Rhode Island to Maine. While not officially Cosa Nostra, the Morelli gang was Bucala's main competition in Greater New England. Bucala and Lombardo ran New England Mafia with an iron fist until the 1950s brought great government and federal scrutiny, and the two old-time mafiosos retired, handling the reins to up-and-coming mafioso Raymond Patriarca. I'm glossing over this stuff here because I'm going to do a future episode on this time period and the transfer of power and the start of the Patriarca Borgata. This video was primarily to discuss the beginnings of the Italian Mafia in Boston and how the Italians took over the city. So even though Boston was always known as the greenest city in the United States, the Italian Mafia lorded over the city's rackets for the vast majority of the 20th century. The whole myth of Whitey Bulger being the boss of Boston was a media and FBI creation. The Italian Mafia never played second fiddle to Whitey. He was small potatoes compared to them. Anyway, I hope this video was hopefully entertaining, informative, and not upsetting in any way. If you liked it, hit the like button, subscribe if you're not subscribed already, leave a comment, make a request. Thank you to all my viewers and subscribers. This whole experience has been absolutely amazing. Please, folks, try to make the best choices you can, take good care of yourselves, and have a great day.